The wind whipped mercilessly across the snow-covered plains of Wyoming Territory, turning what had been a clear December afternoon in 1878 into a sudden, violent blizzard. Rose Abbott hadn't planned to be caught in it. Nobody in their right mind would, but fate rarely consulted plans when dealing its hand. Rose clutched her thin cotton dress against her body, the fabric offering almost no protection against the biting cold. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably as she staggered forward, each step becoming more difficult than the last. The snow had already risen to her ankles, and the white landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, disorienting her further with each passing minute. Fool girl, she berated herself through blue lips. Should have listened to Mrs. Henderson about the weather changing. But the warning from the general store owner's wife had seemed excessive on such a bright morning, and Rose had set out for her teaching position at the small schoolhouse 2 miles outside of Lone Pine without her winter coat. Now, as the temperature plummeted and the daylight faded, Rose began to understand just how grave her error had been. Her fingers were numb, her legs increasingly unresponsive. She had heard stories of travelers freezing to death in Wyoming winters, bodies found perfectly preserved in the snow come spring thaw, looking as if they'd merely fallen asleep. No, she murmured, forcing herself forward. Not like this. Just when the thought of simply sitting down in the snow began to seem seductively reasonable, Rose heard it, the faint sound of hoofbeats cutting through the howling wind. She turned, squinting through the blinding white, and made out a dark silhouette approaching on horseback. The rider pulled his horse alongside her, looking down from beneath a wide-brimmed hat crusted with snow. His face was partially obscured by a bandana, but his eyes, startlingly blue against his wind-reddened skin, widened at the sight of her. "Madam, what in God's name are you doing out here?" The man's voice was deep, resonant even through the shrieking wind. "L lost," Rose managed, her voice barely functioning. "School teacher. Need to get back to T-Town." Without hesitation, the stranger dismounted, his boots crunching in the snow. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed for the weather in a heavy sheepskin coat and leather chaps. In one fluid movement, he unwrapped the wool blanket from around his saddle and approached her. "You'll freeze to death out here," he said, draping the blanket around her shoulders. The sudden warmth was so intense, it almost burned her frozen skin. "Town's 5 miles that way, and this storm's getting worse. My place is closer. I can get you warmed up, then take you to Lone Pine when it's safe." Rose hesitated. She didn't know this man, and accepting his help went against everything a proper lady should do. But as another violent shiver racked her body, she realized propriety might cost her life tonight. "Thank you," she stammered as he helped her onto his horse. "Name's Quinn Thornton," he said, mounting behind her and pulling her close against his chest, enveloping her in his warmth. "Hold tight, Miss Abbott. Rose Abbott." "Well, Miss Abbott, let's get you home before you turn into an icicle." Quinn urged his horse forward through the deepening snow, one arm firmly around Rose's waist. She should have felt scandalized by this stranger's proximity, but all she could focus on was the blessed heat radiating from his body and the steady rhythm of his breathing against her back. They rode in silence for what seemed like hours, but was likely only 20 minutes. Eventually, through the swirling white, Rose made out the silhouette of a cabin nestled among a stand of pines, smoke curling from its chimney. "There it is," Quinn said, his voice close to her ear. "Not much, but it's warm." By the time they reached the cabin, Rose could barely stay upright. Quinn dismounted first, then gently lifted her from the saddle. Her legs buckled beneath her, and he caught her, carrying her the remaining distance to the door. The cabin was blessedly warm, heated by a cast-iron stove in the corner that radiated heat throughout the single-room dwelling. Quinn set her down carefully in a rocking chair near the fire. "Stay put," he ordered, then disappeared back outside to tend to his horse. Rose looked around, taking in her surroundings. The cabin was simple, but neat, a far cry from what she'd expected of a bachelor's quarters in the wilderness. A bed with a patchwork quilt occupied one corner, a rough-hewn table and chairs another. Shelves lined one wall, filled with books more than she would have anticipated, and basic provisions. A rifle hung above the door, and various tools decorated the walls. Quinn returned, stomping snow from his boots before closing the door against the howling wind. He removed his hat and bandana, revealing a face that startled Rose with its unexpected handsomeness. He couldn't have been more than 30, with strong features weathered by outdoor life, and those striking blue eyes that had been her first impression. "Horse is in the lean-to," he said, hanging his coat on a peg. "Storm's getting worse. Looks like you might be stuck here till morning, Miss Abbott." Rose felt a surge of panic. "I can't. That is, I shouldn't. Madam, I understand your concern, but there's no alternative unless you prefer freezing to death." Quinn's tone was matter-of-fact as he moved to the stove. No one in Lone Pine would think twice about it, given the circumstances. "Now let's get some hot coffee in you." As he busied himself with the coffee pot, Rose became increasingly aware of her sodden clothes clinging to her skin. Quinn seemed to notice her discomfort. "I have some spare clothes you can change into. They'll be too big, but they're dry." He pointed to a trunk at the foot of the bed. "Help yourself while I fix us something to eat. You need to get out of those wet things before you catch your death." With trembling fingers, Rose opened the trunk and found a flannel shirt and a pair of trousers that looked like they might stay up if she rolled the waistband several times. She glanced at Quinn, who had deliberately turned his back to give her privacy. "I won't look," he promised, seeming to sense her hesitation. "Cowboy's honor." Rose changed quickly, grateful for the dry clothing despite its impropriety. The shirt hung to her knees, the sleeves extending well past her fingertips, but the fabric was soft and warm against her skin. "Decent," she called softly when she'd finished. Quinn turned, and something flickered in his expression when he saw her swimming in his clothes. He cleared his throat. "Coffee's ready, and I've got beans and bacon I can heat up. Nothing fancy." "That sounds wonderful," Rose said, settling back into the rocking chair, still wrapped in his blanket despite the change of clothes. "I can't thank you enough, Mr. Thornton." "Quinn," he corrected, pouring coffee into a tin mug and handing it to her. "Out here, formalities seem a bit excessive when you're saving someone from freezing to death." Rose accepted the mug, letting the warmth seep into her palms. "Quinn, then, and I'm Rose." She took a sip, the hot, bitter liquid warming her from the inside. "What were you doing out in that storm anyway?" "Checking my trap lines," he replied, stirring the beans in a cast-iron skillet. "I raise cattle primarily, but I supplement with trapping in winter. Was heading back when I spotted you a splash of color against all that white." He glanced at her. "Now, what was a schoolteacher doing out there without even a coat?" Rose sighed, feeling foolish. "I underestimated how quickly the weather could turn. It was clear when I left the schoolhouse." She shook her head. "I've only been in Wyoming territory for 3 months. I'm still learning its ways." "Where are you from originally?" Quinn asked, dishing beans and bacon onto 2 tin plates. "Boston," Rose replied, accepting the plate he offered. "I came west for the teaching position. The advertisement said they needed educated women to help civilize the frontier." A smile tugged at the corner of Quinn's mouth. "And are we sufficiently civilized yet, Miss Rose from Boston?" She laughed despite herself. "Not entirely, though I'm finding the wilderness has its own kind of appeal." Their eyes met briefly before Rose looked away, suddenly self-conscious. The impropriety of her situation struck her anew, alone in a cabin with a man she'd just met, wearing his clothes, sharing his food. Yet she couldn't find it in herself to feel truly alarmed. There was something about Quinn Thornton that inspired trust, despite his rugged appearance. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the howling wind outside. Rose found herself studying Quinn surreptitiously. His hands were large and calloused, speaking of hard work, yet he handled his utensils with unexpected grace. There was an intelligence in his eyes that suggested he was more than just the simple cowboy he appeared to be. "How long have you been in Lone Pine?" she asked finally. 5 years, Quinn answered. "Came out after the war, looking for a fresh start. Worked as a ranch hand until I saved enough to buy this place." "The war?" Rose echoed, calculating quickly. He must have been quite young. "Joined up when I was 17, Quinn said, reading her thoughts. "Served 3 years with the Union cavalry. Saw things no boy should see." His expression darkened momentarily, then cleared. "But that's ancient history now." Rose wanted to ask more, but sensed his reluctance. Instead, she said, "Your cabin is lovely. I'm surprised by all the books." Quinn's expression softened. "My mother was a school teacher. She believed education was the most valuable thing a person could possess." He gestured to the shelves. "Feel free to browse. I've read most of them multiple times." After they'd finished eating, Quinn insisted Rose take the bed while he would sleep in the rocking chair. Despite her protests, he was adamant. "I've slept in worse conditions," he assured her. "1 night in a chair won't kill me." As Rose settled under the patchwork quilt, exhaustion overtook her. The last thing she remembered before drifting off was Quinn adding wood to the stove, his profile outlined by the firelight, strong and steady as the mountains themselves. She woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Daylight filtered through the cabin's single window, revealing a world transformed into a glistening white wonderland. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine landscape under a brilliant blue sky. Quinn stood at the stove, his back to her. "Morning," he said without turning. "Hope you slept well." Rose sat up, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance. She smoothed her hair as best she could. "Better than I had any right to, given the circumstances. Thank you." Breakfast was a quiet affair, both of them seemingly aware that their unusual arrangement was drawing to a close. Rose found herself reluctant to return to town, to the prying eyes and wagging tongues that would inevitably accompany her reappearance after spending the night away. "I'll take you back to town after we eat," Quinn said, breaking the silence. "Your clothes are dry now, though you might want to keep the blanket for the ride." "I couldn't possibly keep your blanket," Rose protested. "Consider it a loan then," Quinn replied. "You can return it next time you pass by." The idea that there would be a next time hung in the air between them, unaddressed but not unwelcome. After changing back into her now dry dress, Rose emerged from behind the privacy screen Quinn had improvised with a blanket. He was waiting with her boots, which he'd placed near the stove overnight to dry. "Thank you," she said, taking them from him, their fingers brushing briefly. "For everything. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me." "No need to dwell on that," Quinn said gruffly. "Anyone would have done the same." But they both knew that wasn't necessarily true. The frontier could be as unforgiving in its people as in its climate. The ride to Lone Pine was almost peaceful in the bright morning sunlight. Rose sat in front of Quinn again, but this time she was fully aware of his solid presence behind her, the strength in the arm that steadied her, the clean scent of soap and pine that seemed to cling to him. As they approached town, Rose felt a pang of regret. Their brief encounter was ending, and despite its unusual nature, or perhaps because of it, she was sorry to see it conclude. The streets of Lone Pine were already busy with morning activity. Shopkeepers cleared snow from their storefronts, children threw snowballs in the street, and women gathered at the well, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. All activity seemed to pause momentarily as Quinn rode in with Rose seated before him. He stopped in front of the boarding house where Rose had a room. "Here we are, Miss Abbott, safe and sound." Rose dismounted with his assistance, aware of the curious gazes from passers-by. "Thank you again, Mr. Thornton. I'm forever in your debt." Quinn tipped his hat, his expression unreadable. "No debt between us. Just be sure to wear a coat next time you venture out in December." With that, he turned his horse and rode away, leaving Rose standing in the snow, clutching his blanket and watching until he disappeared from sight. The next few days were predictably difficult. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house with an iron fist and unwavering moral standards, gave Rose a lecture about propriety that lasted nearly an hour. The mothers of several of her students expressed concern about her fitness as a teacher after such a scandalous episode. Only the school board's desperate need for a qualified teacher prevented her immediate dismissal. Through it all, Rose found herself thinking of Quinn, his quiet strength, his unexpected gentleness, the books that lined his walls, speaking to a depth most wouldn't suspect from looking at him. 2 weeks after the blizzard, a package arrived for Rose at the schoolhouse. Inside was a winter coat, sturdy and warm, with a simple note: "So it doesn't happen again. QT." The gesture touched her deeply, not just for its thoughtfulness, but for what it represented: concern for her welfare from someone who barely knew her. She knew she should return it, that accepting such a gift was improper. But the practical side of her acknowledged its necessity. Instead, she resolved to thank him properly and reimburse him somehow. Her opportunity came the following Sunday after church services. As the congregation filed out into the crisp winter air, Rose spotted Quinn standing apart from the crowd, looking uncomfortable in a clean shirt and vest that seemed at odds with his usual rugged appearance. Gathering her courage, Rose approached him. "Mr. Thornton, I didn't expect to see you here." Quinn shifted his weight, hat in hand. "Don't make it to town much, especially in winter, but I had business at the general store." His eyes met hers. "And I wanted to make sure you were faring well after your adventure." "I am, thank you," Rose replied, aware of the curious glances from churchgoers passing by. "And thank you for the coat. It was incredibly generous, but I can't possibly accept such a gift. Please allow me to pay you for it." Quinn shook his head. It's not charity, Miss Abbott. Consider it an investment in keeping Lone Pine schoolteacher alive through the winter. A smile played at the corners of his mouth. This town needs all the civilization it can get. Rose couldn't help but smile in return. At least let me invite you to dinner as thanks. Mrs. Henderson serves Sunday dinner at the boarding house, and guests are welcome. The invitation surprised even her. It was forward, perhaps too much so, but she found she didn't care. Quinn hesitated, glancing toward the boarding house where several town matrons were already gathering, their expressions disapproving. Another time, perhaps, he said finally. I don't think your reputation needs another blow on my account. His tone was light, but Rose detected a hint of bitterness beneath it. My reputation is already in tatters, Rose said boldly. What's one more scandal? Quinn's expression softened. You're a brave woman, Rose Abbott, but I wouldn't do that to you. He placed his hat back on his head. I should be going. Got a long ride ahead. Before he could turn away, Rose said quickly, I still have your blanket. I could bring it out to your place next Saturday, if that's convenient. Quinn studied her face for a long moment. If you're sure that's what you want. It is, Rose said firmly. Saturday, then, he agreed with a nod, then walked away toward his horse. Rose watched him go, ignoring the whispers around her. For the first time since coming to Wyoming territory, she felt a thrill of anticipation that had nothing to do with her teaching duties or her mission to bring civilization to the frontier. The week crawled by with excruciating slowness. Rose found herself distracted during lessons, her thoughts wandering to the cabin in the woods and its solitary occupant. She told herself it was mere curiosity about a man so different from the gentleman she'd known in Boston, but deep down, she recognized it as something more. Saturday dawned clear and cold. Rose dressed with care in her sturdiest dress and the new coat, packing Quinn's blanket in her satchel, along with some fresh-baked bread, and preserves a token of appreciation, she told herself, nothing more. She hired a buggy from the livery stable, ignoring the stableman's raised eyebrows, and set off in the direction Quinn had taken her that night. The journey seemed longer than she remembered, and several times she feared she'd taken a wrong turn, but eventually she spotted the cabin nestled among the pines. Smoke rose from the chimney, and as she approached, the door opened. Quinn stood framed in the doorway, looking surprised despite their arrangement. You came, he said simply as she pulled the buggy to a stop. I said I would. Rose climbed down, retrieving her satchel. I've brought your blanket back as promised, and some bread to thank you properly. Quinn stepped forward to take the horse's reins, tying them to a hitching post. Come in. It's too cold to stand around outside. The cabin looked different in daylight, smaller somehow, but also more inviting. A fire crackled in the stove, and the scent of coffee filled the air. I was just about to have some, Quinn said, gesturing to the pot. Would you like a cup? Yes, please. Rose removed her coat, hanging it on a peg next to Quinn's. The domestic gesture felt strangely intimate. They sat at the table, coffee steaming between them, an awkward silence stretching until both spoke at once. I've been thinking. They laughed, the tension breaking. Ladies first, Quinn said. Rose took a deep breath. I wanted to thank you properly for saving my life, not just with bread, but with words. What you did was extraordinary, and I haven't adequately expressed my gratitude. Quinn looked uncomfortable with the praise. Anyone would have done the same. No, Rose insisted. Not everyone would have. Some might have ridden past, or worse. You showed me kindness when I needed it most, with no thought of reward or impropriety. She met his eyes directly. That speaks to your character, Quinn Thornton. Quinn's gaze dropped to his coffee cup. My mother raised me to help those in need. Nothing special about doing what's right. He looked up again. Now what about you? A Boston lady coming all the way out here to teach in a town like Lone Pine. That takes courage. Rose smiled ruefully. Or desperation. Teaching opportunities for women in Boston are competitive. Out here, they're desperate for anyone with an education. Is that the only reason? Quinn asked perceptively. Rose hesitated, then admitted, no. I wanted adventure. A life beyond the drawing rooms and societal constraints of Boston. My father died 2 years ago, and suddenly I was expected to make an advantageous match, settle into a life of domesticity. She shook her head. I couldn't do it. Not yet, anyway. I needed to see more of the world first. And has Wyoming Territory lived up to your expectations of adventure? There was amusement in Quinn's voice. Getting lost in a blizzard wasn't exactly what I had in mind, Rose laughed. But yes, in many ways it has. There's a freedom here I never experienced back east. The landscape alone takes my breath away. It's not an easy life, Quinn warned. The winters are brutal, as you've discovered. Summer brings drought, and there's always the risk of fire, or conflicts with native tribes, or any number of hazards. Life in Boston had its own hazards, Rose replied, just of a different sort. She paused, then asked, "What about you? Do you ever miss the East?" Quinn considered the question. "Sometimes. I miss certain conveniences, certain comforts. But I don't miss the crowds or the noise or the way a man is judged by his family name, rather than his own merits." He gestured around the cabin. "Out here, what you see is what you get. There's honesty in that." They talked for hours, the conversation flowing naturally as they discovered shared interests in literature and history. Quinn revealed he'd attended 2 years of college before the war interrupted his studies. Rose spoke of her childhood dream to write stories of her own someday. When the light began to fade, Rose realized with a start how much time had passed. "I should be getting back to town before dark," she said reluctantly. Quinn nodded, though he seemed as reluctant as she felt. "I'll saddle my horse and ride alongside you. These roads can be treacherous at dusk." The journey back to Lone Pine was filled with comfortable conversation, punctuated by moments of companionable silence. When they reached the edge of town, Rose expected Quinn to bid her farewell, but he insisted on seeing her safely to the boarding house. "People will talk," Rose warned. Quinn shrugged. "People already talk. Might as well give them something accurate to discuss." As they pulled up in front of the boarding house, Rose saw the curtains twitch in several windows. Mrs. Henderson herself stood on the porch, arms crossed, expression severe. "Thank you for escorting me home," Rose said, gathering her courage before the inevitable confrontation with her landlady. "My pleasure," Quinn replied, then hesitated before adding, "I ride into town every other Saturday for supplies. Perhaps we could meet for coffee at the hotel restaurant next time, if you're not too concerned about the gossip." Rose smiled, her heart lightening. "I'd like that very much." Over the following weeks, their Saturday meetings became a regular occurrence. Sometimes they would have coffee at the hotel. Other times, Quinn would escort Rose on rides into the surrounding countryside when weather permitted. They discussed books, debated politics, and shared stories of their pasts. Rose learned about Quinn's experiences during the war, and he heard about her sheltered upbringing in Boston. Gradually, the townspeople's gossip faded into background noise. Rose's dedication to her students and her proper behavior in all other matters slowly rebuilt her reputation. Quinn began attending church services regularly, and his quiet generosity during a scarlet fever outbreak, providing meat for families too sick to hunt or work, earned him grudging respect from even the most judgmental citizens. As winter gave way to spring, Rose found herself looking forward to their meetings with an eagerness that both thrilled and frightened her. Quinn Thornton was unlike any man she'd ever known, direct, honest, intelligent without pretension, strong without cruelty. When he spoke, he looked her in the eye as an equal. When she expressed an opinion different from his own, he considered it thoughtfully instead of dismissing it. One Saturday in early May, Quinn suggested a picnic by the creek that ran near his property. The day was perfect, wildflowers carpeted the meadows, and the creek burbled merrily over stones polished by centuries of water. They spread a blanket, the same one he'd wrapped her in that fateful night beneath a cottonwood tree, and unpacked the basket Mrs. Henderson had prepared, the boarding house mistress having finally surrendered to the inevitable and accepted Quinn as a suitable escort for her tenant. "It's beautiful here," Rose said, breathing in the scent of new grass and wildflowers. "One of my favorite spots," Quinn agreed, settling beside her. "I come here to think sometimes when the cabin walls start closing in." They ate and talked, the conversation as easy as it had always been between them. After they'd finished, Quinn grew unusually quiet, plucking a stem of grass and twirling it between his fingers. "I've been meaning to ask you something," he said finally. Rose's heart quickened. "Yes?" "Your contract with the school board ends next month, doesn't it?" Not what she'd been expecting. "Yes, though they have asked me to renew for another year." "And will you?" Quinn's eyes were intent on her face. Rose hesitated. "I haven't decided. I've received a letter from a school in Denver offering a position. The salary is better, and it's a larger school in a more established city." She watched his expression carefully. but I've grown fond of Lone Pine." Quinn was silent for a long moment. "I've always believed people should pursue what makes them happy," he said finally. "If that's Denver for you, then that's what you should do." Disappointment crashed through Rose. "Is that all you have to say on the matter?" Quinn looked at her, something vulnerable in his expression. "What would you have me say, Rose?" "I'd have you tell me what you want," she said boldly. Quinn set the grass stem aside and turned to face her fully. "What I want," he said slowly, "is for you to stay, not just in Lone Pine, but with me." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Rose Abbott. Have since that night in the blizzard, I think, though I didn't recognize it right away." Joy bloomed in Rose's chest, bright and warm as the spring sunshine. "I was beginning to think you'd never say it." "Does that mean—" Hope lit Quinn's eyes. "It means I love you too," Rose said simply, "and Denver holds no appeal if you're not there." Quinn's smile was brighter than she'd ever seen it. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I'm not a wealthy man, Rose. My ranch is small, and the work is hard. But I promise you won't lack for anything essential, including love and respect." "That's all I've ever wanted," Rose replied, squeezing his hand. "A partnership of equals." Quinn leaned forward, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek. "May I kiss you, Miss Abbott? Seems about time after all these months." Rose smiled. "I thought you'd never ask, Mr. Thornton." Their first kiss was gentle, a promise exchanged without words. When they pulled apart, Quinn's eyes were bright with emotion. "Marry me, Rose, not because you're stuck in Wyoming territory, but because you want to build a life here with me." "Yes," Rose answered without hesitation, "though Mrs. Henderson might faint at the news." Quinn laughed. "Let her faint. The whole town's been expecting this announcement for months anyway." They were married in June, in Lone Pine's small church, with wildflowers decorating the simple altar and the entire town in attendance. Rose wore a dress of pale blue silk her mother sent from Boston, along with a letter expressing both concern and reluctant blessing for her daughter's unconventional choice. After the ceremony, they rode to Quinn's ranch, their ranch now, where he had spent the spring making improvements, a new kitchen garden, curtains on the windows, and a bookshelf he'd built specifically for Rose's collection. "Welcome home, Mrs. Thornton," Quinn said as he carried her across the threshold. Rose looked around at the cabin that had once sheltered her from a blizzard and was now to be her home. "It's perfect," she said, meaning it. That summer, they expanded the cabin, adding a proper bedroom and enlarging the main living area. Quinn's cattle herd grew, and with Rose's help, they began keeping better books and making smarter investments. She continued teaching, riding to and from the schoolhouse each day on a mare Quinn gave her as a wedding present. By the following winter, the cabin had transformed into a proper home, filled with books and conversation and love. On cold nights, they would sit by the stove, sometimes reading aloud to each other, sometimes just talking about their days. "Do you ever regret it?" Quinn asked one night as they sat wrapped in a quilt, the same blanket he'd wrapped around her that first night. "Giving up Boston, choosing this life instead?" Rose leaned against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Never," she said truthfully. "Though I do miss indoor plumbing on occasion." Quinn laughed, the sound rumbling beneath her ear. "Someday," he promised, "when we're rich cattle barons." "I'll hold you to that," Rose replied, tilting her face up for a kiss. Outside, snow began to fall, but inside their cabin, all was warmth and light. The blizzard that had once threatened Rose's life had instead given her everything she'd ever truly wanted: adventure, purpose, and a love as vast and enduring as the Wyoming sky. Years later, when their children asked how they met, Quinn would wink at Rose and say, "Your mother was lost in a blizzard with no coat. I wrapped her in my blanket and led her home." And Rose would smile, because home, she'd learned, wasn't a place at all, it was wherever they were together.